Recorded in progress. Everyone who's on Zoom, here we go. Who's ready to go? Hot Topics is our new series. We're going to come with controversial opinions, hot takes, clickbait. It's going to be great. So I'm just going to Zoom, folks. I'm going to mute everyone. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to participate. I want to begin with the story. Today's topic is cancel culture. A Torah perspective on cancel culture. I'll tell you all the story. Once upon a time, I was in North Carolina. I go to North Carolina almost every summer for the last many years. I'm going to say it's about 15 years, more than that, many years. We go to North Carolina, to the Outer Banks. Our family goes to vacation. It's fantastic. And usually the way you get there is you're on the major highways. But every now and again, if you're leaving or coming on a Sunday, beach town, bad traffic, there's an accident, Waze has you get off the highway, and I'm kind of taking the back road and, kind of to avoid the I-95, if you've ever been on I-95 on the East Coast, not the 95 here. 95 here ain't nothing like I-95 on the East Coast. So we're taking the back routes, and we're on US Route 1. Now, if you know anything about US Route 1, it goes from, Bangor, Maine, all the way down to, Chile. It goes all the way down. And I'm driving in North Carolina, kind of in the middle of nowhere. This is, I'm going to say 15 years ago, before cancel culture was a thing. And I'm driving, and I'm getting onto US Route 1 in North Carolina. And lo and behold, you know what it's called? You know what the name of the highway is? It's called the Jefferson Davis Memorial Highway. Now, for those who don't know, who aren't, for the uninitiated, who is Jefferson Davis? So I'm a little bit of a amateur student of American history. Who is Jefferson Davis? Who knows? Anyone? Raise your hand for 100 points. President of the Confederacy.
Our president.
Say our friends from Tennessee, right? The president of the Confederacy. And I remember driving, and again, cancel culture wasn't a thing. And I'm like driving, Jefferson Davis Highway? Jefferson Davis was the greatest trader in the history of the United States of America. Significantly bigger trader than Benedict Arnold. Jefferson Davis, probably should have been hanged from a sour apple tree. What are we doing? What in the world are we doing? Naming highways after a traitor. Ignore, nothing to do with cancel culture. This is before cancel culture was a thing. And I remember I couldn't figure it out, just purely from an American history perspective. I just couldn't figure it out. And right then and there, I became the first advocate of cancel culture. We need to change the highway. We need to take down statues. No, but it really did. I remember it was just such an interesting moment. It's kind of my personal introduction to the topic of cancel culture. And, I figured, it's certainly a hot button issue these days. The last year or two, has been a real thing. Just last week, for those of you following the news, our good friend Whoopi Goldberg, had an insensitive comment. Cancel Whoopi, cancel this, cancel that. And it's an interesting thing. So just a couple of introductions before we really get started. One thing that I found is, when it comes to, this specific issue, cancel culture, and for that matter, many, hot button issues, people tend to have very strong opinions. And oftentimes those strong opinions are very predictable. Person fits on this side of the political spectrum, they're going to feel that way. Person who lands on that side of the political spectrum, they'll feel a different way. And that's great. Mazel tov. Everyone should have your strong opinions. And that's great. Sometimes, all the time, whenever I go when I see these kinds of current event kind of issues, really our knee-jerk reaction with a little bit of humility and a sense of bigger perspective should be, well, I know what I think about it. I know what you think about it. What does God think about it? Let's look at some Torah sources to try to at least give us some context on the issue. And really throughout this whole series of hot topics, particular tonight, I want to kind of look at what the Torah talks about and kind of break down some of these issues. Now, when it comes to something like cancel culture, I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion for two reasons. And the reason why it's hot button, have you ever seen people get very heated about cancel culture? 99 times out of 99 times, the two participants are not talking to one another. Why? Because it's an ambiguous topic for two reasons. Number one is, and this is, people ask me, a lot about cancel culture. Let's talk specifically about taking down monuments, statues, as being someone, people think, oh, Rabbi Matt, he's the American history guy. Not that I am, but I like American history. So people ask, Rabbi, what's your opinion on it? My first thing, why I think it's such an ambiguous thing, is before we even talk about, what the Torah has to say about it, is to recognize, number one, not all statues are created equal. Different people in American history or world history, not everyone is the same. For example, I don't think anyone in this room, or hopefully no one in North America should have the following opinion. We should erect statues to Adolf Hitler. Right? That's obscene. That's absurd. Adolf Hitler was a villain on every level. And if someone doesn't understand that and thinks we should be erecting, statues for Adolf Hitler, this class is not for you. I'm going to be wasting your time. That's a black and white. That's not, if you can't see that, I think it's being kind of unreasonable. Like Adolf Hitler is not someone who should be celebrated. He should be someone who's condemned. Well, there's a big difference between Adolf Hitler and Thomas Jefferson, potentially, or Andrew Jackson, or Jefferson Davis, or a couple other people that I'm going to want to talk about in a moment, to recognize before we even get into the issue, it's not one size fit all. Different people and different issues are different. And you kind of have to treat all these situations case by case. That's number one, why I think oftentimes people are just not talking to one another. Mr. A thinks we should be taking down a statue. Mr. B says no. Maybe we don't have the same outlook. We're not talking about the same person. Not all situations are the same. All situations are different. Too many double negatives, but I think everyone got what I'm saying. Number one. Number two, when we talk about cancel culture, it's not a singular question. In other words, let's stick to one particular subject, Andrew Jackson. We're going to go through a couple different people. But to recognize when we talk about, should we take down his statue? Should we, cancel him? There are several factors at play. It's not a one question. It's, I guess, a broad topic that I think a lot of times what's helpful is to realize there are a lot of little subcategories or considerations. And what I've tried to do, and it's not exhaustive by any level at all, is to sort of break the issues down and kind of isolate variables. Like, what about this issue in a vacuum? What does the Torah say about that? What is a Jewish perspective about individual issues? So if someone says, Andrew Jackson's statue should come down, another person says, no, it shouldn't, realize, what are you asking? That there might be 7 things at play over here, and you're talking about one of them, and you're talking about a second one. Try to isolate the issues. I'm going to be talking a lot about taking down statues, just because I pardon the pun, but I feel that's like concrete. It's like a concrete example. And I recognize when it comes to cancel culture, we could be canceling Whoopi Goldberg. We could be canceling, Andrew Jackson. We could be canceling a million things. I'm going to primarily, not exclusively, let me say the majority we're going to talk about statues. I just think they're historical figures and to identify specific issues. With one caveat or 2 caveats. When it comes to something like statues, monuments, and I was trying to think here, what does the Torah just ignore cancel culture? Imagine that we're talking about a saint, the greatest person in the world. Do we put up what does the Torah even say about putting up monuments? Statues, graven images are not a particularly Jewish idea to begin with, but I'm not going to get kind of into that concept. I'm going to kind of work under the assumption, but I do want to acknowledge it's sort of an important question that has to be dealt with. Like, who cares? Or what's the value of erecting a statue to begin with? Why do we care about these things? We can think of a couple things. Maybe there's something called national pride in general. We want to build a monument. We want to build a statue, a memorial in recognition, in honor of significant people in our history, in the history of our country. Maybe there's an element, which is a very Jewish idea, hakara satov, gratitude, to people who came before us, who set the stage for our lives today. And those things kind of need to be considered, okay, so I'm not sure how to quantify the value of building a statue. Let's say building a statue is going to offend one person, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. the Torah puts a lot of weight on not making people feel uncomfortable. Well, at what expense? I don't know how to quantify building statues. So I just kind of want to flag that, but I don't want to get stuck on that. Let's just work for the argument's sake. Statues, monuments, maybe we shouldn't be building them because of, graven image issues. I don't exactly know what service they have, what purpose they serve, but let's assume that they're a real thing. Does that make sense? Everyone with me? Okay. I guess you'd start without even really I guess it's more still also as a background. Don't think that cancel culture is totally against the Torah tradition. Totally against. That's not true. There's a verse in Proverbs, a verse in Mishlei that says, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, V'Shem Rishayim Yirkav. The memory of the righteous should be for a blessing. And that's, a very well-known verse. The second half of the verse is V'Shem Rishayim Yirkav, the name of the wicked shall be, should rot. It means should be obliterated. I believe it's based on that verse. And I say it halfway as a joke, but it's not a joke, right? Famously, where do we apply this principle? We do it twice a year. Purim. We say the name of Haman. We cancel Haman. We're trying, what do we say? And when we talk about the Nazis, if you ever heard anyone say, we talk about Adolf Hitler, people usually they'll say Adolf Hitler, Yimach Shemo V'Zichro. May God obliterate his memory. And in Judaism, there is a concept, we want them obliterated. We want them canceled. We want everything about them to be, destroyed. So it's not like it's a completely foreign idea. The question is how do we, apply it, or how does this really make any sense? So I want to go through a handful, maybe one, depending on our time, I've identified 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different issues that we need to consider. There are probably a dozen, 3 dozen more, but I came up with 6. We'll see how many we'll get through. And I'm going to go through each one of them by trying to isolate a specific variable, and we're going to talk about specific examples. My first example, first statue, our first monument. Now, I should preface it. I'm sorry, folks. I'm from the DC area. And what do you have in DC? Monuments. Everything about DC is statues, monuments, memorials. The whole city is, we got a statue for this guy, a monument for that guy. We dedicate this for the other guy. It's all over the place. One of the classic monument statues that you'll go to, it happens to be some beautiful work of art. If, again, I don't know, we're not supposed to celebrate graven images, so I don't know how that works, but it's beautiful, is if you go in DC, right along the tidal basin, highly recommend going in March. I actually did this last year. I haven't been there in 1,000,000,001 years. I was in the DC area, right around mid-March to see the cherry blossoms. Everyone ever go to DC? You get the cherry blossoms come out. They're on the tidal basin, right along the edge of the Potomac. They bloom for about 20 minutes. You got to catch them. It's unreal, right? They bloom for 20 minutes, and then it rains, it snows, it gets windy, and they're gone. I was there. It was on Passover. It was beautiful. The cherry blossoms were out. We saw them, stunning. I'll show you the pictures. But if you go right along the tidal basin, you'll find the statue for Martin Luther King Jr. It's a pretty cool work. Anyone ever seen it? It's like him standing. He's coming out of a piece of granite. You've seen it. It's a beautiful work. I just finished reading a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. It's called, I believe it's Bearing His Cross. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. It's somewhat controversial, but it's probably the best book written on Dr. King. Martin Luther King Jr. was, in my opinion, an absolute American hero. He was. There's no way around it. He was a remarkable person. And there we have a statue commemorating Martin Luther King Jr. I want to share with you a passage that I've shared before. It's a remarkable insight. If you recall the story, we know the story, the Jews' the exodus from Egypt. If you read the commentaries carefully, you'll take note, not all the Jews made it out of Egypt. You ever see anyone familiar with that passage? You'll note many of the Jews were not worthy of God's redemption. And we were taught many Jews died out during the plague of Choshech, or darkness, or according to other opinions, different times. But a significant amount of Jews did not make it out of Egypt. One of the most insightful questions, I love this question, asked by the Rush, writing in the 1300s. He asks, Yesh Lishal, one can ask the following question. We know all the evil, the wicked of the Jewish people, those who are not worthy, they die out during this period of darkness. Those who are not worthy of God's redemption, they die out. Yet, Dasan v'amiram lomesu, sharisham gemurim. We find two biblical villains who we know were alive in Egypt before the redemption, and we do find them later on during the Jewish experience in the desert, which means they were part of the people of the Exodus. They did make it out. And these two villains are two people named Dasan and Aviram. If you recall, Dasan and Aviram, they are two of the lieutenants during Korach's rebellion later on in the biblical narrative. They are kind of the head rabble-rousers. These are no good people. And we also find that before the Jewish redemption, Dasan and Aviram were big troublemakers and really opposed Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses' leadership. Asks Rush a remarkable question. If we know the wicked didn't make it out of Egypt, how did Dasan and Aviram, what were they worthy of? How did they get out? It's a great question. Says Rush, a remarkable answer. Yesh Lamar, you can explain. Even though they were wicked, they were terrible people, they did not give up hope of God's redemption. Meaning, they were wicked, they were Rashayim, they were evil. But they prayed and yearned, and they believed in God's redemptive ability. They prayed during their Shemona Esrei, please, God, get us out of Egypt. And in that merit, they made it out. I've always found this to be one of the most remarkable insights. Because, you see, in life, we like our villains being villains, and we like our heroes being heroes. We like Moses being a saint. We like the pharaohs being the Disney character, villains with the long pointy beards and the evil cackle, and everything about them is bad. Reality is, in life, there are very, very, very few heroes, and there are very, very, very few villains. 99.999% of humanity is somewhere in the middle. And sort of point observation number one, I don't think this is a brilliant insight, but it's something to just crystallize in our mind. When we talk about cancel culture, get it. Sometimes some people's transgressions are really, really evil. Adolf Hitler, I don't care if he gave flowers to his mom, he's a villain of the worst order. We understand that. But to recognize as we move farther and farther away down the level and scale of absolute Disney character villain, and we get to people who had terrible indiscretions, I'm not apologizing for anyone, recognize that people are typically not black or white, pardon my pun, right? People tend to not be black and white when it comes to being good or evil. People tend to be gray. Or better yet, people have mixes. I've done a lot of black, I've done a lot of white. People are not perfect. People are complicated. People do both very, very good things and very, very bad things. Does that mean we should be taking down monuments, not taking down monuments? Again, it's case by case, but always recognize there are people who've done very, very good, who've got a little bit of bad in their resume or significant bad in their resume, and people who've got a lot of bad in their resume, who've also got a little bit of good in their resume. And that, again, creates this ambiguity of how do we deal with, when we talk about cancel culture, recognizing we like to villainize and demonize the bad and praise and herald the good, recognize that's not real life. Read this book, Bearing the Cross. It's a remarkable book. And you read about the fact Martin Luther King Jr. was not the saint that people turned him into, even during his own lifetime. He was a womanizer, which was well documented. He was pretty much an egregious sexist today, using today's standard. He was a sexist. He thought women were inferior. I don't know if he would have articulated that, but he was a womanizer, a sexist. He had a lot of real deep flaws. And I guess the question that needs to be asked is, should we be taking down the statue, the monuments of Martin Luther King Jr.? We got every major city in the United States of America has an MLK street. Should we be canceling Martin Luther King Jr.'s day? It's an interesting thing. The epilogue of that book is about a paragraph and a half long. It is profoundly deep. Forget the name of the author. Again, it's a Pulitzer Prize winning book. So this guy knew what he was doing. And I don't have the exact text in front of me, but he basically writes the following. Martin Luther King Jr. a mistake that people make is to think that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to project the image of saintliness. He did not. He was very open about the fact that he was a deeply imperfect person. He acknowledged it, he stated it, he knew it, and he was very open and uncomfortable with the fact that people viewed him as a Messiah when he acknowledged he had a lot of personal flaws. And what's really interesting is the end of the book basically argues, I don't know if it was the author's point of view, but I think he was saying, like, if Martin Luther King Jr. would see what people have, how they've totally turned him into this saintly figure, Martin Luther King Jr. probably been tremendously uncomfortable with that for two reasons. Number one, when we expect our leaders, when we expect people who are the real influential people, when we expect them to be absolute perfect saints, so we realize, well, you know why we live in such an imperfect society today? Well, we don't have perfect leaders. We don't have people that rise to that standard. And we sort of come to this stagnation of, well, you know why we live in a society, well, we just don't have leaders that are perfect anymore. And that's a mistake. Recognize some of the greatest men of all time, and women for that matter, are deeply imperfect because they've done a lot of good, but they've also done a lot of bad. And the second point, which is probably the more profound, is a lot of times we don't ourselves accomplish the great things that we think that we might be able to accomplish because we look at our flaws and we say, look, I'm a deeply flawed person. I've got all these limitations. I've got all these transgressions. I've got all these imperfections. How could it possibly be that I'm going to be the one to make a big difference in the world? How is it possible that I'm going to be the one to do great things when, after all, I've got X, Y, and Z massive flaw? And that's a mistake because people are mixtures of good and bad. And we can't let our transgressions, our imperfections, our deep flaws, from holding us back to accomplishing great things. So I think it's an important perspective. Perspective number one, do I think Martin Luther King Jr.'s statue should come down because of his indiscretions? He was a terrible woman, very well documented. He was a sexist. Should we take down his statue? I don't think, my personal opinion, strong opinion, we should not. But what do you mean, Rabbi? He's done X. What about all those transgressions? I get it. You got to take the good with the bad to some degree. And I think in his case, he really was a tremendous figure again, from an American history perspective. And with the recognition, I'm not claiming that he's he's a saint. He's not. Observation number one. Okay, let's move on to our next statue. Oh, this is my favorite. I talked about this on the high holidays. So for those who are there with us on the high holidays, this will be a review, but it's worth your time. If you happen to be going to Warrenton, Virginia, I suggest you stop at the intersection of Waterloo Street and Ashby Street. Because at the intersection of those two little streets in Warrenton, Virginia, it's in Fauquier County, kind of near, it's kind of general DC area. But if you go to that area, you will see one statue, a monument. It's a what are those called things? The obelisks? Thank you. I can't pronounce these words. You see them in print. You have no idea how to pronounce it. An obelisk with an engravement and an image and a dedication and a plaque and a memorial for my good friend, John Mosby. So if you were at our explanatory service on Rosh Hashanah, you should remember the story of John Mosby. Who was John Mosby? I'll tell you who John Mosby was. John Mosby was one of the greatest villains of the Confederacy. John Mosby had what was called the Mosby, we got someone in the chat, someone called Mosby's Raiders. What was Mosby's Raiders? I'm going to mute everyone. What was Mosby's Raiders? So we had the Confederacy, we know the Civil War, the good guys, the bad guys, the North, the South. Mosby had a detachment. He was kind of, I think, a captain of a regiment of about 1,500 cavalry soldiers. They would ride on horseback and they would ride behind enemy lines, constantly destroying the long supply chains. If you recall, during the Civil War, one of the greatest challenges that General Grant had, especially as he's going deep into the South. Again, I apologize, my friends from Tennessee. He laid waste to your beautiful state. Well, not so much, but more to our friends in Georgia and the like. But he messed up Tennessee pretty good. General Grant would be separated often very far from his supply lines. So he would have these long baggage trains, these railroads, telegraphs to stay in communication. What would happen? John Mosby would go around with his raiders and would be constantly attacking and marauding and pillaging anything of value from behind his enemy's lines in the north. And he was ferocious. He was if you read the descriptions of people at the time, he was like that kind of guy that little boys like idealize. He was tough. He had guns everywhere. He was just like a real tough guy. The great story is probably one of the best Civil War stories and he would go and he would sneak up on people because you never knew. When you fight in an army, there's the bad guy, especially back in those days, you had the bad guys over here, the enemies here, and you would line up and you saw who were the gray coats. He was called the gray ghost people because he used to, attack and then vanish back into the countryside, back into the public, or even into civilian life. They would take off their uniforms. And one story, the legend, it's a true story. There was a death warrant out on him. Basically, he was one of the few soldiers that there was an order to kill him on sight. He was just that terrifying of a person. He was probably the most deeply hated, probably one of the most deeply hated people of, in the entire Confederacy. It was John Mosby. And there's this one story how he broke into the North, the Union. There was a small detachment, and there was a general lying in bed, and Mosby walks into the room with his revolvers out, wakes up the general, and the general says, who are you? Why are you waking me up? I'm a general. You can't wake me up. Who are you? And to which Mosby says, have you ever heard of John Mosby? To which the general says, have you found the scoundrel? No, I think the line was, oh, have you got the scoundrel? To which Mosby says, no, but he's got you. And it was a great line, right? He was a villain. He was hated. Of all the people in the South, one of the most vile people. And here we have a statue in good old Warrenton, VA, for John Mosby. Should we take down the statue? By the way, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag. I think they should be renaming the Jefferson Davis Highway. I still believe that. I think it's crazy. I think it's insane. I don't know how our country can allow. You don't name highways after traitors. Why do we have a John Mosby obelisk? Obelisk? Thank you. I apologize. Obelisk. Should we be knocking down the John Mosby obelisk? One of the most beautiful passages in the Torah. See if I can find it. We know the story in the Torah. We know the story we just alluded to, the rebellion of Korah. Speaking of rebellions, read the story of the rebellion of Korah. Korah, he goes ahead and he accuses Moses. He says, Moses is hoarding all the power. He says, Moses, your nepotism, your Aaron, you made him the priest. Then Korah goes ahead and he slanders Moses, creates a rebellion. And a huge segment of the Jewish people end up following Korah. And it was a national tragedy. Korah is punished. We know the story. Yet the verse tells us, if I can find it. I don't think I can find it quick enough. So you'll trust me on this. But the Torah later on, a few weeks, shortly after, backhandedly alludes to the fact B'nai Korach lo mesu. When God goes ahead and after the rebellion of Korach, God destroys Korach. He destroys the rebellion. The rabble-rousers, those who were in charge of the rebellion, were killed by God. Yet the verse tells us, B'nai Korach lo mesu. The children of Korach, they do not die. And indeed, if you look at the Tehillim, and anyone ever noticed, if If you look in the Tehillim and the Psalms, there are several Psalms that are called Lam Natseach Livnei Korach Mizmar. There are several Psalms, several chapters in the Tehillim that are composed by none other than these children of Korach. Now, it's very clear from, if you read the rabbinic literature, you read the Midrashim, you read the sources, these Bnei Korach, these children of Korach, were deeply involved and committed to the rebellion. They were deeply committed to their father, to Korach, and to rebelling. Yet, lo mesu, they do not die. What happened? Why not? Everyone else was killed. The Medrash tells us, you know what happened to Bnei Korach? The last moment, the showdown at the OK Corral, when Moses, really calls Korach, and puts his finger on him and says, "You really going to cross this threshold of rebellion? Are you going to cross the line? At a certain point, there's a line of no return. Once you cross this line, I'm telling you, you're not going to be able to make it back." And Korach and his 215 henchmen and many others, they crossed that line. You know who didn't cross the line? Figuratively. You know who didn't cross? His children, the Bnei Korach. The last moment, they said, "You know what? This is a mistake. This is a mistake. We can't. You know what? We're doing the wrong thing." They said, "No, we're backing up. This is incorrect." And it's one of the most fundamental principles in all of Judaism. And it's something that we talk about cancel culture. It's something that needs to be deeply understood, and something that I think our society needs to calm down a little bit, is to recognize people make mistakes. Bnei Korach, the children of Korach, they made a terrible mistake. If you contextualize it, if you rebel against Moses, if you go ahead and you say, "Moses, I think you're a sham. I think you're a phony. I think you're a fraud, Moses." You know what that's called in Judaism? It's called heresy. We recite in the Yud Gimel Ikram, we recite 13 principles of Jewish faith. Lo kam b'Yisrael k'Moshe od. We believe in the divinity of Moses and his Torah. And here you have the children of Korach. They crossed that line. They originally were on Korach's team, which means they were in violation of one of the deepest principles in all of Judaism. It was an act of heresy. Yet, guess what they did? They changed. You know why? Because people can change. It's one of the most fundamental ideas, and that's why we talked about it in the High Holidays. So the High Holidays is all about tshuva, repentance. People make mistakes. That's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but it is okay because we can change. We could repent. And if you recall the end of the story of John Mosby, for those who recall from the explanatory service, and if you don't, you need to come back more, right? Story of John Mosby is after the war ends, Civil War ends, Union wins, South loses. There were a few people, Grant, it was a bit of a scandal, but everyone got over it. Grant pardoned, he basically paroled the entire South. As long as you take a loyalty oath, you're taking a loyalty oath to the Union, he didn't, all the soldiers who fought, not to the, I don't want to oversimplify it, but to all the soldiers who fought and to General Lee, he essentially paroled everyone. And he said, as long, go back to your fields, go plow your fields, go home. And that's basically angered a lot of the rabble-rousers in the North. They wanted everyone to be hanged from that sour apple tree. There were a few people who it was just unclear if the parole would apply to. People like Jefferson Davis and John Mosby. John Mosby was a wanted man because he had created so much anger, so much resentment in the North and the army. He basically had to go into hiding because he did not think that he was paroled. People just hated him so much. Fast forward, what happens? Ulysses Grant goes ahead and reassures him. He writes him a personal letter, basically saying that I, Ulysses Grant, 5-star general, hereby certify no one should harm John Mosby. He paroled, he made his oath of allegiance, let him be. And John Mosby was deeply touched by that. And you fast forward to the year 1868, when Ulysses Grant is running for president. And Ulysses Grant needed some supporters. He was fighting the Democrats. He's running against the Democrats. In 1868, he basically wanted to continue essentially slavery, but not slavery, but, tremendous repression of the blacks and really set the country back. Guess what John Mosby did? John Mosby basically realized he was wrong his entire service, everything that he fought for, everything he stood for, he recognized it was a terrible mistake. And he campaigned for Ulysses Grant. He became a Republican. Back then, the Republicans were the Liberal Party and the Democrats were the racists. And he campaigned for Grant. He became his campaign manager in Virginia. Why? I'll tell you why. People change. And when we go ahead and we look at people who make mistakes and we say, cancel them, recognize, people do change. John Mosby was a changed man. He was eventually appointed, I think, ambassador to he ended up having a very big role in the United States government. I think he was like, he had a very prestigious job. He changed. I'll give an example. I'm going to get my head chopped off. I'm going to be a little controversial. Whoopi Goldberg. I do not think she should be canceled. Do I agree with what she said? No. It's horrible. People make mistakes. I don't know. I have no idea. She comes back contrite. I feel bad. I apologize. Let her back. We're a country that shall allow for forgiveness. Every time someone makes a mistake, we say, off with your head, you're canceled. We're not giving people opportunity for growth. I think that's a terrible mistake. One of my favorite examples, everyone remember Michael Vick? Do you remember the story of Michael Vick? Yeah. It's horrible. Do you remember that? Michael Vick was the most talented quarterbacks. If you ask, we're talking about Martin Luther King and race and the whole issue of cancel culture, ask Black athletes today who they idolized growing up, they're going to tell you Michael Vick. He was one of the first great Black quarterbacks. He was fantastically gifted. I happen to think he wasn't that great. Quarterback, he was too small. But people idolized him. He was a hero. And if you remember the story, in the middle of his career, the prime of his career, right? Remember the dog abuse allegation? Not allegations. It was proven. It's horrible stuff. You're a dog person. If you're not a dog person, it was terrible. The dog fighting down in the South was terrible. Goes to prison for, I think it was like 2 years, a year and a half, 2 years. Comes out of prison. Some people never forgive him. And Michael Vick understood that. And Michael Vick came back. I believe Andy Reid gave him a new job, gave him a second job, right? Of all people, Andy Reid, right? I think it was Andy Reid in Philadelphia. I think it was Andy Reid who gave him a job. He ended up playing 2.5 more years at a very high level. And now I think today he's an analyst. I think he works for ESPN. I know he did for a while. Now, I don't know what's going on in Michael Vick's heart. Was he contrite? Maybe he really hates dogs and still loves abusing dogs and everything is a sham. Could be, but it might not be. Everything that you see about him, he looks contrite. He spent a year and a half in prison, realized he got swept. Why was he in that dog fighting thing? I don't know. It was a cultural thing where he was from, down south. That's what they do. And I think I'm not apologizing for him. It was a terrible mistake. He was horrible. If you watch some of those videos, you can't. They're so disgusting. If you don't believe that Michael Vick could be contrite, I don't know. I can't judge. Only God can judge. But if you don't think it's possible for someone like that to make that kind of egregious mistake, go to prison and genuinely in his heart of hearts realize, chatasi, I made a mistake. And I'm going to do better. If you don't believe that's humanly possible, I feel bad for you. Because in Judaism, we believe deeply people can make mistakes. We have choice. We can make mistakes. We can improve. And we have to, it's I think one of the big concerns when it comes to cancel culture, particularly when we're dealing with people who are still alive. It's one thing when we're talking about people who are dead, who never repented and never tried changing. I get that. But particularly when we're dealing with current events, people who are alive today, be very, very careful. Be very, very careful canceling people and not allowing people for forgiveness. It's not a Jewish ideal. In Judaism, we allow for forgiveness. That's item number, whatever we're up to. Can we talk about another statue, another monument? If you go back in Washington, D.C., there's another very, very popular monument, very tall also. Probably the most noticeable and recognizable monument in all of Washington, D.C. And of course, I'm referring to, no, I don't want to talk about the Washington Monument. Let's talk about a different monument. It's right next to the Washington Monument, on the other side of the Washington Monument. You have the Lincoln Memorial. On the other side, separating, you go to the Washington Monument, and if you go to D.C., if you haven't been to D.C., you need to go. It's a beautiful city. That spot, the tidal basin, if you're going to do one thing in DC, don't do the museums. Go see the Washington Monument, walk the tidal basin, see the Lincoln Memorial, go walk back to the cherry blossoms if you're going in March, walk along the tidal basin. You'll see the World War II Monument, beautiful. Vietnam Memorial is there, the Korean War Memorial, absolutely beautiful places. And one of the highlights, speaking of Martin Luther King having a dream, where does he have his dream speech? On the steps, done very intentionally, of the Lincoln Memorial. Now, if you study the story of Abraham Lincoln and you read his attitudes to African Americans, he was very clear. He believed blacks were on a lesser level in terms of their humanity than whites. He absolutely did. He was what you would call an absolute racist. If you read his comments, just read his biographies, read what he feels about blacks. He never thought that blacks would be able to be integrated into real life, to be, really living together side by side with whites. He never would have thought, he never would have imagined that. He never would have believed that. Should we go, it's not, you don't have to dig too deep to find that. Should we be going ahead and taking down the Lincoln Memorial? Should we take the absolute racist comments? Should we take down the Lincoln Memorial? One of my favorite passages, great story in the Talmud. Great historian, Rabbi Beryl Wein, should live and be well, loves quoting this story in the lesson. It's a story of the great Rabbi Ashi. Rabbi Ashi, if you're familiar in the Talmud, he's actually one of the two people who redacts the Talmud. So he's kind of like not the author, but he's the person who puts the Talmud together. Him and another rabbi named Ravina. So one day, Rabbi Ashi is giving a class, and he ends up the class, he's got a bunch of students, and he says, all right, folks, tomorrow we're going to talk about King Menashe. Is everyone familiar who King Menashe is? King Menashe was King Hezekiah's son. King Hezekiah, of course, was a very, very righteous, one of the most righteous leaders in the history of the Jewish people. However, he had an evil villain son named King Menashe. King Menashe is one of the greatest villains in the history of the Jewish people. He was an absolute Rasha Marusha. He was evil to the core. And as Rabbi Ashi ends his class, he concludes the class. He says, tomorrow we're going to give a discussion. We're going to talk about the reign of King Menashe. And he says something disparaging about King Menashe. That evil villain. He calls him a name. And ends his class. Rabbi Ashi goes to sleep that night, and who makes a guest appearance in his dream? None other than King Menashe. And King Menashe asks Rabbi Ashi, he says, what are you doing making fun of me? And Rabbi Ashi says, well, you're a villain. Rabbi Ashi, and then King Menashe, it's all happening in dream. King Menashe goes and asks Rabbi Ashi, says, let me ask you a question. What are you guys studying? What's like the most difficult issue that you're studying, currently in the yeshiva? Like what's troubling you? Nothing to do with me. What's on your mind? And Rabbi Menashe says we're actually studying this very intricate law. Has to do with the story of Netilat Yadayim. There's a law of washing your hands in certain circumstances, and there was a matter of confusion. And Rabbi Ashi says to King Menashe in his dream, we're struggling through this particular issue. King Menashe in the dream gives him the answer. He says, "This is what you do." Proves it based on a source and explains it. Blows away Rabbi Ashi. And Rabbi Ashi says, well, wait a minute. I thought you're the evil villain, King Menashe. What are you doing? You really just had some serious Torah scholarship and wisdom. How could it be that a villain like you, is able to resolve our deep Torah question? Now, I don't understand how dreams work, but this is all happening in a dream. King Menashe tells Rabbi Ashi, let me continue. Rabbi Ashi basically says, he kind of extends his question. He says, look, it's very apparent from our conversation, says Rabbi Ashi, that you, King Menashe, are a brilliant Torah scholar. He says, what were you doing being a villain? I don't get it. You're such a smart, righteous person. Why were you chasing idolatry your whole life? After all, look at you. You're a brilliant Torah scholar. King Menashe tells Rabbi Ashi a powerful, very important lesson. He says, Omar Lay, he says back to Rabbi Ashi, Ihadis Hassam, he says, if you, Rabbi Ashi, the great Rabbi Ashi, guy who writes the Talmud, had you been around during my day, Havanakitna b'shipule glime. You would have picked up like the hem of your coat. Virahitna basre. And been running after me, chasing me to do and worship idolatry. You wouldn't have just been one of the people to worship idolatry. You would have been running after idolatry. You wouldn't just be running. You would be putting on your cleats, your running shoes, because you've been so focused on transgression and sin. That's the story. Rabbi Beryl Wine, remarkable historian, loves this passage. He would always say, I don't exactly know what the lesson, exactly how to understand the story. But I think he's right. I think one of the lessons that's being taught here, I don't want to get too deep into idolatry. I don't know how this stuff works. Nowadays, we don't have a tremendous passion for idolatry. But back then, they did. And Menashe was telling Rabbi Ashi, I don't think Rabbi Menashe was justifying his sin. He wasn't justifying his idolatrous behavior. He wasn't justifying the fact that he was a bad person. What he was saying, he was teaching Rabbi Ashi an important lesson. You were not alive during my generation. And you don't know what the temptations, you don't know what life was like, 1,000 years earlier when I was alive. And you're using today's standards and what's today's issues to judge people in a different time. And that's not so fair, because it's very likely, had you been there, you would have done the same. You just don't know. Now, I'll give you an example. I've got a lot, I'm not going to, this isn't like a confessional. I'm not going to share with you all of my deep sins, but I'm not a perfect guy. I'll tell you one thing that I don't struggle with. I don't struggle with taking false oaths. I have, to the best of my knowledge, never taken a Torah scroll, held it up, or, taken an oath using the name of God. I swear by the name of God, and taken false oaths. I've got a lot of shortcomings. That's not one of them. I don't find that particularly compelling. I don't find that like, oh my gosh, I have this urge, this rage. I need to go and take oaths in the name of God. Now, taking oaths in the name of God and not following through is a terrible transgression. I've got a lot of shortcomings. That's not one of them. I'll tell you something else. As a rabbi, I do a lot of counseling. I meet a lot of people. I have never met someone ever in my life who said, Rabbi, I got something that I need you to help me. I've got, everything, what's wrong? Bill, well, everything's good at home. I'm doing fine. I just have this one problem. I have this thing. I make oaths in the name of God and I can't stop. Right? Has anyone ever encountered that? No, you've never encountered that. Guess what? If you read the literature, this is a historical fact. You read the literature of what were the big challenges in the 1400s. You'll see all the writings and all the responsa. They're all railing about their communities. Everyone's taking these oaths and we need to stop. Everyone's taking false oaths and it's inappropriate. And all the rabbis getting up from the bema and, fire and brimstone. What are they talking about? Folks, we got to stop taking these oaths. And you sit there you read. This is by the way, ask, people who study this stuff. It's everyone. It's everywhere. You read in the Rishonim, these works of Jewish ethics. It's all they're talking, not all they talk about, but it's a big thing that they talk about. And you read and you wonder, what in the world? What was going on? What was in the water in the 1400s? What's the big, I got no shortage of temptations and shortcomings. False oaths ain't one of them. I don't know what the answer is. I have no idea. But I'll tell you, apparently in the 1400s, this was something that people struggled with. It's not fair to assume that the nisyonos, the challenges that we have today, are the same nisyonos, the same challenges that they had yesterday, and vice versa. We have to recognize every generation has their set of challenges and their set of circumstances. And generation A is different than generation B. And it's not necessarily the wisest thing to do to look at a previous generation and use a certain baseline of today's generation to compare it to. Did Abraham Lincoln say things that were absolutely racist and abhorrent? The answer is an unequivocal yes. Those statements are wrong. They're terrible. But anyone who goes ahead and says, therefore, we should take down, the Lincoln Memorial, right, is totally missing historical context. Abraham Lincoln was the savior of the blacks of his generation. The black people, generally speaking, African Americans, called him Father Abraham. He was a savior. Think about where our society was back then. Blacks were chattel property. And here was a man who stood up and said, this is wrong. And he literally gave up his life for that cause. Not figuratively, literally. And he changed the world. Now, did he get the football across the goal line? No. Does he have major shortcomings based on I'm not to say that he shouldn't have known, but he should have known better. But if we go ahead and say, well, because he didn't get that football across the goal line, we should take down the statue. That's like Menashe telling Rabbi Ashi, I'm no saint, but don't think that had you been there, you would have been better. And we all go ahead, we can look at Abraham Lincoln and say, he's a racist, the language that he uses. And it's true. I'm not denying that. But recognize that he was 1,000 miles ahead of his society back then. And had we been there, you been there, and the next guy been there, he probably would have been way worse than Abraham Lincoln. And anyone who thinks we should be taking down the statue of Abraham Lincoln, I don't think you have a historical perspective. I don't. Abraham Lincoln's statue, Meth's verdict, don't take it down. It's a mistake, it's an absolute mistake. It's a mistake. I get it. His racial attitudes are not correct. But what he accomplished based on what his generation was going through is a million miles away. My next character I want to talk about real quick, a few more minutes and we'll get out of here. It's not a statue, but it's a book that I read as a child. My hunch is that most people who are watching or most people who are participating, also read. When I was in elementary school, I'm going to say about 5th grade. So I used to go on a van or like a bus to school. I used to go to school, and I grew up in Southern Maryland. The school wasn't a good fit. There was a group of kids. We used to go on a bus all the way to Baltimore for elementary school. And we had different bus drivers, and some were good, most were not. I had one bus driver for about, half a year, 3/4 of the year. If I think back of my childhood and people who were most impactful in my life, a couple teachers come to mind. Many teachers don't come to mind. And there's one bus driver, Earl. Earl was one of the gentlest, nicest people I ever met in my entire life. And I remember the day he told us that he wasn't going to be driving us anymore, I cried the entire afternoon. He was such an important person in my life. Earl was a great man, a great man. He taught me love. He taught me friendship. He taught me how to trust in others. He taught me what it meant to care. Earl was a black man. And I'll never forget a crazy story. I was reading the book Huck Finn. Everyone read Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. I will never forget this moment, not realizing how awkward a moment this must have been. I liked sitting next to Earl up in the front because he was just a great guy to talk to. But at that particular bus ride, I was sitting next to a friend and I was talking about the book Huck Finn. I must have been in 5th grade at the time. I didn't understand this one part of it. Is everyone familiar with Huck Finn? How he runs away? It's one of the classics. And I remember talking to one of my friends who just started the book, and there was this one thing I didn't get with Huck. He has this good friend, I think it was Tim. I think it was Tim. And I said, what is I use the N-word. That's how he's referred to in the entire book. I'm like, what is, I didn't understand. He's like, I remember I was telling the story to my friend. Yeah, so Huck is going down the Mississippi River with his, and I didn't know what the word meant. I was asking, what is that? Can you explain it to me? And I remember my friend turning purple because Earl's listening to my conversation. And afterwards, when I got off the bus, my friend said, "Are you an idiot?" And I'm like, "Yes, I am." He explained to me it's an offensive word. I had no idea. I didn't realize it at the time. Oh, how I wish I can ask Earl, what were you thinking? And this little white Jewish kid, is talking about this, I'm going on and on about his name, this, that, and for 5-10 minutes. What was going through your mind? Schools want to get rid of Huck Finn. Many schools have got rid of Huckleberry Finn. They don't teach it because exactly of my experience. Exactly my experience. They uses offensive language. And many, many school districts no longer teach Huckleberry Finn. If you remember the story, Jewish people, they sin. The golden calf. God says, we're going to destroy the Jews. We're going to destroy, rebuild. Moses prays to God, and God teaches Moses the 13 attributes of God's mercy. Does everyone remember that? Now, Hashem kal rachum lechanan, God is merciful, he's compassionate. 13 attributes of God's mercy. And it ends, poked avon avos abanim v'albanei banim. That God, he goes ahead and he'll punish people for their sins. He'll punish you, and he'll punish your children and grandchildren. Talmud asks, punish children and grandchildren? That goes against a very non-Jewish idea. The Torah tells us very clearly, people are accountable for their own shortcomings. People are responsible for their own sins. I'm not responsible for my dad's sins. Why does God say I'm going to punish kids for their dad's sins? Explains Rashi, quotes, it's really a passage of the Talmud. This is we're talking about situations where children replicate the sins of their fathers. Dad sins, and then the kids follow in those footsteps and continue to sin. They're held extra accountable. Now, the Talmud doesn't explain why. I have a theory. I might be wrong, but my theory is, our previous generations, parents, people who came before us, they can either be tremendous inspirations for us, or they can be cautionary tales of what to avoid. And if a person goes ahead and he's got their parents were sinful, and you went ahead and you continued in those very ways, you gave up the opportunity to learn, that's what I don't want to become. That's what I don't want to be. And I think part of the lesson is we should study history. Look at what happened before us. Don't try to cover up the warts. We come from a very imperfect past. And you need to see that the world was not a perfect place if we want to learn how to try to make it a little bit more perfect today. You read Huck Finn, you read Mark Twain, who's the greatest abolitionist of his generation. Now, that book is not a racist book. That book was actually written with the exact opposite intent. It was written as a book of abolition. And yes, is the language offensive? Yes, I understand that. But if we're going to take that out of the curriculum, how are you going to expect the next kid like me to understand that conversation I had on that bus was offensive? It's a terrible mistake. I don't think we should be canceling Huck Finn. Huck Finn should not be canceled. Keep him in. We'll end with the one last thing. The hour is late. We're going to end right here. One last statue. It's one of the most prominent statues in all of DC. If you go down 16th Street, you're heading from north to south down 16th Street. 16th Street ends where? Smack in the White House. But right before it ends in the White House, it ends in something called Lafayette Square. Beautiful, big area, beautiful area right before the White House. And in the middle, smack in the middle, and you can see it from 5 miles away. As you go down 16th Street, you can see the White House right down. But right before the White House, there's a statue of one Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson's statue was defaced. They tried taking it down. It was one of the real subject of cancel culture was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, in my opinion, probably deserves to have a statue down. He was a bad person. People don't realize that. He was a really rotten guy. Now, did he do a lot for our country? Yes. But he was a murderer, a killer, vicious, cruel, deeply bad person. Andrew Jackson is one of my least favorite historical figures. I hate Andrew Jackson personally. That's my own 2 cents. I don't know if you take down the statue, don't take down the statue. But suffice it to say, historically, Andrew Jackson, the criticism that he gets, he deserves. He was a very, very bad person. Now, did he do a lot for our country? Yes. And that, therefore, is it hard to say take down a statue? I don't know. You got to go figure out all these points. But he's a complicated guy. But I'll tell you what shouldn't have happened. What we saw back in 2020, take down a statue, what we saw was a mob. One of my rabbis wrote the following, and I want to read it. He was talking about the January 6th fiasco. And he said, I'm not really writing about January 6th. I'm talking about these types of riots and mobs. He says any mob has two problems. A lack of das means a lack of using our brains and not regarding civility as a virtue. We saw the lack of das of our brains in the way the events unfolded. They follow the typical script of a populist revolt. Simple slogans, unencumbered by nuance and unburdened by proof. Stop the steal, the deep state, rigged election. These are serious accusations. In order to prove them, one needs a calm, deliberate forum to consider evidence and to weigh it. The courts of law repeatedly ruled that no material evidence was even offered by those questioning the election. But rousing slogans were fired at machine gun pace. Common cerebral deliberation seemed to be the furthest thing from people's minds. I make these comparisons understanding that there are important distinctions between the events of January 6th and the ones I'm about to mention. But if you have seen clips of extremist leaders rousing the masses, the dynamic is eerily familiar. People relish the simplicity of the message, the adrenaline rush, the ready solution to their woes, and a roar of thunderous satisfaction greets the speaker. This lack of employment of rational process and das, our brains, is but one half of the necessary ingredient. The other factor is not regarding civility as a virtue. If people don't see menschlichkeit, civility, as a virtue, then what is to stop them when they become distraught or frustrated from behaving the way that mob did? We tend to have mental images of what is doable or praiseworthy action. If animal behavior is constantly pictured as fun or heroic, then given the chance, wouldn't that be our default behavior? If patience and civility are the hallmark of a loser, what would we want? Would we want to be a loser? He goes ahead and he says, you know what the Torah example of a mob is? Torah describes a mob as the chet ha'ego, the sin of the golden calf. You know I probably just offended a lot of people with that, and my rabbi did with that January 6th thing. I will stand by that the day I die. Making an accusation, I don't know. Was it stolen? Was it not? That was a mob. Those people are not acting with das, with seicha, with intellect. There was a lack of civility. It wasn't just January 6th. It was those groups taking down Andrew Jackson's statue. Those are serious charges, serious considerations. Should we take down Andrew Jackson's statue? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, honestly. Personally, he's not my favorite historical figure. Did he accomplish a lot for this country? Absolutely. It's nuanced, as we've described. We went through many, many reasons why it's not so simple. It's not case by case. It's not one size fits all. There are many calculations. Was it stolen? The election? I don't know. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. It's a fact. It's not an opinion. Neither it was or it wasn't. Figure it out. But acting like a mob, taking down a statue like a mob, that is not a Torah value. If you want to say, I believe the election was stolen, we need to figure it out. It's a fair point. Come up with it using menschlichkeit, civility, being mevakesh emes, seeing the truth. Person says, you know what, I think as a country, we need to think whether we should be having, and praising statues and have monuments for someone like an Andrew Jackson. Fair point. Mob mentality is not a Jewish approach. I probably just offended a couple people. That's fine. Hot topics. We're supposed to be offensive. We're supposed to have strong opinions. I believe ultimately cancel culture, again, it's not a case-by-case thing. There are very, very specific issues. And, I don't know. It's not a clear-cut thing. I don't know about the Andrew Jackson thing. I'll end with one last thing. I think another option is keep the statue up, rewrite the plaque. Maybe that's a different way of doing it. Rewrite it. I don't know. Anyway, the hour's late. I want to thank you all for coming. If anyone wants to stick around for questions, I'm happy to. Please God. I want to just end. There's sort of going to be a part 2 to this class, which is going to be a class on censorship and free speech, which is very, very closely connected. That's not next week. I forgot what's next week. I don't know, but check your schedule. I think we got another good one. We're doing the role of gender, and I don't remember what's next week's topic, but it'll be good. But anyone who has any questions, please feel free to stick around. And have a good night, everyone. You bet.
I have a question.